We are talking everything Seamaster 300, from the leaked watch to the development of the line, and where exactly do we see it going. It's no secret that I am very fond of the Seamaster 300. Bear in mind, not the professional line, but the precursor, the watch that really established the identity for Omega. Even though it is a line in the family that is very underrated and not spoken about often in the community, I still rate it to be one of my top 10 favorite sports watches. There are many good reasons why, which I hope to address in this video. But let's start with the main talking point, which is the leaked model. It was supposed to be launched in 2020. Of course, a few setbacks happened, so we expect to see this watch released this year, even as early as April, as far as we know. Basically, a specification sheet was photographed and that circulated around the internet, and there have been a few discussions and videos made about this watch. Now, the images I've been able to see, I'm sure you can find them online too. The issue with them is that they are not the easiest to talk around. There aren't any clear renders that you can really use to back up your claim and your information, so I recreated it. The image is about 90% accurate, and as we are sitting here right now, this is probably the most detailed launch image on the internet at the moment. But before we get into the specifications and discuss those elements, to understand this watch we need to look back a little bit to the few generations that have come before it, and from those aspects we can piece together what this watch is trying to represent. So what is it about the Seamaster 300 that feels special, that feels unique? Well, it is the ancestor. Though the Seamaster Professional is often touted as the best in the line, for those who want to get into a dive watch that is reliable, dependable, in my opinion, this watch represents the brand a lot better, purely because every element you see is unique to Omega. The few bullet points I've put on the screen tries to explain my summary of this watch. I greatly appreciate the balance it shares on the dial. The space allocations between the numerals, between the batons, between the minute marks, the handsets, the quarter Arabics. What they allow the watch to do is appear more casual, a more dress-focused piece, not something so extreme. It does ride the line very nicely. And then it's the congruence, the way these elements share and occupy the dial so well. Everything from the sharp ends to the lugs, to the sharpness of the batons, the hands, there seems to be such a good relationship between everything. And we have noticed how this DNA has been used again and again within the Planet Ocean line, within the Aquaterra. The Seamaster has established this identity that has been extrapolated and used with some of the most important professional models that Omega now makes. So what the brand tries to do with this line is pay tribute to those originals. How it does that is it focuses on those key traits, those identifiable DNA elements, and uses them in such a way that keeps the watch looking vintage, keeps the watch looking old school. And you can see it very clearly looking at the generational development of this line. There are pros and cons to this, which is something I will address later on in the video when I do a redesign. But the basic cliff notes you need to know is that the original piece, the CK2913, was the one that established the dive watch for Omega. 39mm in size, it adopted the broad arrow handset, aluminium bezel, tropical dial, female centerlinks. A lot of these attributes we will now see in the most modern iteration. One feature about this watch which is quite hard to document is that there are at least 8 generations of this variant. The CK2913-1, 2, 3, all the way up to 8. And in there we see nuance, like we see different handsets, we see different dial arrangements. But this is largely where the inspiration for these modern pieces come from. And you can see where they cross-pollinate variations from the Dash 3 to the Dash 5, the Dash 7, to get the results that we see. Technically, the model that we're looking at on the screen now, the 1957 reissue, is based on the CK2913-3. Just a little bit of trivia. Now, these watches were released as a limited edition. They are still available today, and they are brilliant pieces. This comes from an owner of one of them. But we move to the modern iteration, the modern take that was actually released in and around 2014, about 3 years before the reissue was released. This model that I have named the 2015 Seamaster 300 adopts many features that we've already seen, but put it in a modern package. Everything from scaling the watch up to 41mm to adding a metal alloy bezel, and a few other features like shifting the way the type is printed on the dial, using a mil-spec inspired seconds hand, which we actually saw on much later iterations of the original diver, predominantly when they were adopted by the Ministry of Defense and needed a professional case. A few other details change, like the crown is larger, And the center link, no longer is it female, it's actually male. So you have an extruding center link. What's nice to see is that this model stays true to that original watch. All it does is modernize, simplifies a few factors and a few quirks that the original diver had. Like instead of the retrofitted countdown bezel, you now have the bezel that we would commonly see on a dive watch. And the whole aim of this exercise, releasing this watch, is to have it relatable enough, but at the same time it's a piece that does call back to those vintage traits. One of the best releases they ever did with this line was the Spectre edition, which is one of the best collaborative watches we've seen from the Omega family. This watch once again takes the same traits of the vintage diver, but then adds even more detail, more nuance, that makes it a lot more attractive. When you see this watch compared to the, I'll say, civilian model, you can see a few elements that have been flipped around and adjusted that do change the look of the watch completely. It has a GMT bezel insert. It has a lollipop seconds hand, which is an element that was used, if I'm not mistaken, the CK2913-5. But one of the best features that I think modernizes this watch is how the text has been shifted. The 12 on the top of the dial has been replaced with the Omega logo and with Seamaster, leaving the quarter Arabics at the base of the dial and the top of the dial to be dominated by the logo and the name of the watch. This was such a good step forward. It indicates efficiency, modernity, in a much more streamlined way. So before looking at this new model that has just been launched, let's first address why these watches seem to be continuing the trend of paying tribute to these vintage inspirations. And I think the one watch that has broken the mold pretty well is the new Speedmaster that was released early this year. The Professional uses these vintage inspirations. It feels very much like a greatest hits watch. Everything from dot over 90 to recessed dial. And then what we can all appreciate is this watch offers a lot more nuance to its aesthetic. There are many new features to this model that makes it a lot more visually interesting and stimulating. It's not a watch that you would get bored of looking at because of these little aspects. There's always something new to discover, to enjoy, and as an enthusiast you learn all about these features and understand what made these watches so great as they developed. So it seems like Omega is very focused on following these vintage inspirations, following these greatest hits trends. There's nothing wrong with that. There's good things and bad things to say about it. On one side, the positive is that, of course, you have a huge back catalogue. You have so many characteristic, charming, charismatic features that you can add to your watches that make them so much more exciting, instead of following this procedural, manufactured, modern approach. The con is that you're not introducing anything new per se. You are instead fixated on keeping the inspirations old school, and that of course can divide opinion. So we shift to this newly leaked Seamaster, and before discussing the design elements, I want to first focus on a few specifications that have caught my attention. Details like it's receiving a new caliber, the 8912. It's getting a micro-adjust system. The watch is also following on with those vintage inspirations and incorporating a sandwich dial again. It uses a new conical-shaped crown, has a blend of vintage and modern superluminova. The crystal is now domed, which is something that I think many people will appreciate. And all in all, it's a fantastic looking watch. Now looking at the renders of the piece, I couldn't make this judgment clear or not, but it looks like it also has a tapering bracelet, which I think many will enjoy. So in this render, again, I have to tell you that this is not the real released image, this is a mock-up, but it's pretty accurate. There have been a few other features that have been tailored into this watch, like the bracelet itself, not only being tapered, but also having a more slimmed out center link. It adopts a female center link again, which is great. It uses a lollipop seconds hand, which is something that was clearly taken from the Spectre edition. Still keeps the 41mm size, and if we are to look at the dial itself, we can see that there have been a lot of minute changes, mainly when we look at the numerals. First thing that comes to mind is that these look like Panerai numerals, and you wouldn't believe I actually used a Panerai to make this mock-up. The numerals are so accurate that it's a very clear representation of what we're going to see. Just like the batons around the dial, they also will be recessed into the dial, so the same sandwich effect that we know. What I can greatly appreciate is where the type has been situated, where we now see the Seamaster 300 text, which we know comes directly from the CK2913. The Omega logo is in a great place, and no other detail is needed on the dial. That is something that a lot more people should pay attention to. There's no essay explaining about its chronometer certification, any of those factors that are pretty irrelevant when you consider what the watch is. We know that we are dealing with an excellent movement, there is no need to explain it. And I do like that level of subtlety. Some might find it a bit confusing that the numerals now match the color of the batons, and it feels a bit patina heavy. But there are in fact source images that show you that some of the very early divers in this category did in fact have radium painted numerals. So again, it's the brand doubling down on this idea of a 50s dive watch. Now even more so when you look at the type they decided to use. If you close your eyes and imagine that this watch is from the 1950s, everything about it says so. It looks even more old school than the original. But here's the thing. The question we have to ask is this watch going too far in the vintage direction? Now, like I said in the beginning, the 300 line is one that pays tribute to its original dive watches. So of course, it needs to have those traits that made the original diver unique. But will these added features divide opinion even more so? That's the question I ask. Though they have cleaned up the dial a lot and made many improvements that I think will actually boost the appeal that this watch has in the industry. I also feel like that those who do not want the vintage aesthetic, just from a color perspective, won't be interested in this watch. Let's say hypothetically I was given the opportunity to redesign this piece, to reintroduce it as a modern incarnation. As an owner of the original reissue, what would I do? The 300 has the potential to rival many of its contemporaries. In fact, it does. When we look at it from a build quality perspective, when we look at its movement, it goes above and beyond. And what makes it such an efficient dive watch, but also a daily wearer, is that it's a watch that is not obtuse about itself. It's not trying to show off. So visually you need to communicate that the watch is subtle, but at the same time when you look at it, it needs to portray this image of being competent as far as an instrument goes. So why not keep those vintage inspirations, the congruence that you have between the sharpness of the lugs, sharpness of the batons, hands, but modernize it in such a way that it does in fact look timeless. So my interpretation of the modern Seamaster 300 would be to use white elements, make it look modern in that sense. Take the Spectre inspirations and double down on them. Replace the 12 at the top of the dial with a large Omega logo, the name of the watch in red, a lollipop seconds hand. At the base of the dial, remove master coaxial, just say chronometer with the depth rating. It's simple, it's not obtrusive, but it also does harken back to some of those gorgeous vintage aesthetics that we've been speaking about. What you would have then is a watch that looks as timeless now as it would have been 50 years ago. It's still not a watch that boasts about its presence, but it also exudes this confidence that I think the Seamaster 300 deserves. So in a few of these images, I've paired the watches side by side for you to see. I have immense appreciation for this watch, and all I want to see it do is succeed. I want to see it popular, not just from a visual standpoint, but appreciated by its watchmaking. The quality of the movements that these pieces have, the efficiency and the understanding of balance that these dials represent, the simplicity of time telling. Many of these traits, believe it or not, have been lost to time. Most modern dive watches that we see today don't refer back to these first principles. And it's why I believe that these Seamasters have so much potential. They are very much a purist dive watch that not many people know about, that rides the line very casually between sports and professional, that not only can be used on all occasions, but is so visually engaging that you never get tired of wearing them. And it's those facets that make this watch a win in my book.